People in Dodge Creek would later swear they knew exactly what happened that summer afternoon. They said they saw it. They said they heard it. They said the girl had no shame and the rancher had no restraint. But every single one of them was wrong. The truth didn't start with scandal. It started with a train slowing down, metal screaming against metal, and a young woman stepping onto a platform with nothing but a suitcase and a promise that had already begun to rot. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Her name was Emily Parker, and she was 22 years old. The dress she wore had been chosen carefully, light blue, modest, meant to look respectable without looking hopeful. It still clung wrong in the Kansas heat. She held her suitcase tight, fingers stiff because letting go felt like falling. She had crossed 3 states because of letters written in careful handwriting, letters that spoke of land, work, and a man who believed in doing right by his word. She didn't know that words could lie without meaning to. At the edge of the platform stood Thomas Reed. He was 48, tall without trying to be, his shoulders shaped by years of cattle gates and long days that started before sunrise. When he saw her, he took off his hat. Not for show, just habit. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, and that mattered more. He waited until she stepped fully down before moving, like a man who understood space and silence. Leaning near the saloon post was Jack Reed, Thomas's younger brother. Jack watched the moment like it belonged to him. He was louder in every way, quicker to grin, quicker to move, and far too comfortable being seen. When Emily's boots hit the dirt, his eyes narrowed, not with interest, but with decision. It wasn't curiosity. It was ownership, or at least the belief of it. Thomas introduced himself quietly. His voice was steady, careful, the kind of voice that didn't rush trust. Emily shook his hand, relief loosening her shoulders before she even realized she'd been bracing. That was when Jack stepped in, already smiling, already too close. "Well," Jack said, reaching for her suitcase without waiting. "You're smaller than I expected." Emily stiffened, but said nothing. Thomas didn't argue. He simply took the bag back from his brother and nodded toward the road. Jack laughed like it was all harmless. He walked alongside them anyway, talking too much, asking questions that didn't need answers. When Thomas looked away to check the horses, Jack leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough. "You sure you came for the right brother?" He said it like a joke. His eyes didn't. Emily felt it then. That tight feeling between her shoulders. That quiet warning the body gives before the mind catches up. She smiled because women learned to do that when they weren't sure what else would keep things smooth. By sundown, the town was already talking. A young bride, an older groom, a woman without roots in a place that didn't forgive weakness. Thomas noticed the looks and ignored them. Jack noticed them and remembered everyone. As they rode out toward the ranch, Jack stayed just behind Emily's shoulder, close enough to guide, close enough to trap. And as the sky burned red over open land, Jack made a choice he would later pretend had never been his. If the town could be turned, he would turn it. If the woman could be shamed, she could be broken. And if she broke, she would have nowhere left to stand but beside him. Emily thought she was starting a marriage. She didn't know she had stepped into a quiet war between brothers. And quiet wars, in places like this, always drew the most blood. The first week at the Reed Ranch passed without noise, and that made it harder to trust. Summer pressed down on the land, thick and slow, cicadas buzzing like they were telling secrets to each other. Emily learned the days by movement instead of time, feeding chickens before the sun climbed too high, carrying water until her arms ached, standing still in the afternoons because even breathing felt heavy. Thomas kept his distance in a way that felt intentional. He spoke when it mattered and stayed quiet when it didn't. He asked before touching anything that belonged to her, even something as small as moving her shawl from a chair. He never looked at her like she owed him gratitude. That mattered more than she knew how to say. Jack, on the other hand, was everywhere. If a fence post needed fixing, Jack was there, even when it wasn't broken. If Thomas rode out early, Jack somehow found a reason to stay back. He laughed too easily and lingered too long, watching Emily the way someone watched a clock, waiting for the right moment. She felt it when his eyes followed her. Not friendly, not curious, measuring. Thomas felt it too. Men like him didn't miss much. He noticed how Jack's jokes landed heavier, how his smile stayed even when Emily didn't return them. But out here, accusations without proof only made things worse. So Thomas said nothing. The afternoon it happened was cruelly ordinary. The heat made the horses restless, tails flicking, hooves stamping. Emily had asked to learn to ride properly. Not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as someone who belonged. Thomas agreed. He walked beside her near the old windmill, explaining where to place her feet, how to keep her balance. His voice stayed calm, steady. That was when the sound came. A sharp noise from the road. Laughter, maybe. The horse startled hard. Emily slipped. The ground came fast. Pain shot up her leg, stealing her breath. Before she could even cry out, Thomas was there, kneeling beside her, one hand steady on her shoulder. "Don't move," he said. "Just breathe." He lifted the edge of her skirt only enough to see the swelling already darkening her thigh. His touch was careful, respectful, focused on the injury and nothing else. Then Emily heard laughter again, closer this time. Her hand snapped around his wrist. "Don't," she whispered, breath tight. "Someone might see." Thomas hesitated. "Only a second." "Out here," he said quietly, "you don't gamble with a leg." He finished checking the bruise and helped her stand, his arm firm, supportive. Neither of them noticed the rider slowing beyond the fence. But the rider noticed everything. By nightfall, the story had already changed. Someone at the saloon said they saw something improper. A woman at church shook her head and whispered about decency. By morning, Dodge Creek had decided who Emily was. Jack moved like a man, playing his part perfectly. He shook his head with practiced concern. He spoke softly about how dangerous rumors could be for a young woman. He made sure people saw him listening, nodding, caring. Then he found Emily alone near the barn. "People talk," he said gently. "They always do when they don't understand." She said nothing. "I could help," he added. "You don't want this following you. Not this early." His hand hovered too close. Not touching, claiming. Emily finally understood what the tight feeling in her chest meant. Jack wasn't offering help. He was offering control. And as the town's whispers sharpened, the space around her began to feel smaller by the hour. By the next morning, Dodge Creek had finished deciding who Emily was. No one asked her. No one waited for the truth. A woman outside the general store looked her over like she was measuring cloth and found her lacking. A man near the saloon laughed and said something she didn't want to hear clearly enough to remember. The air itself felt different, heavier, like it pressed against her chest where she tried to breathe. Thomas noticed right away. He saw how conversations stopped when he entered a room, how eyes slid away instead of meeting his. He didn't confront anyone. He believed lies burned out when they were starved of attention. Silence, to him, was a kind of faith. Jack believed the opposite. He leaned into the whispers, nodding like a man burdened by concern. He told people he worried about Emily's reputation. He said Thomas didn't understand how towns like this worked, how quickly a woman could be ruined without protection. He planted the idea gently, the way men did when they wanted it to grow without their name attached. Then he went to Emily again. This time he didn't smile. "People don't forgive easy here," he said, voice low, careful. "But they do respect what looks right. A woman with the right kind of husband doesn't get talked about." Emily felt sick. It wasn't the words. It was the patience behind them. Jack wasn't rushing. He was waiting for the walls to close in enough that she'd step into his arms just to breathe. That afternoon, Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. She just looked at the ground and asked one question. "Did I do something wrong?" Thomas sat beside her. The boards creaked under his weight. He didn't answer quickly. He wanted the truth to land clean. "No," he said. "You got hurt. That's all." She believed him. That trust settled something deep in her chest, even as the world around her felt unsteady. Trust, though, didn't stop danger. As evening crept in, Jack made his move. He spoke to the right people. He closed the right doors. He told Emily there was a way out before things turned worse than whispers. Just a short ride. Just a private talk to settle things before the town decided something permanent. By the time Thomas heard about it, it was already unfolding. A look from a ranch hand. A sentence that didn't sit right. Pieces sliding together in a way that made his blood run cold. This wasn't gossip anymore. This was control. As night settled over Dodge Creek, thick and quiet, Thomas knew one thing for certain. Someone was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Night came down on Dodge Creek the way it always did, quietly and without asking permission. The kind of night where sounds traveled farther than they should and thoughts grew louder when there was nothing left to distract from them. Lamps glowed soft behind windows. Somewhere a piano played off-key and then stopped. Emily stood near the edge of the livery yard, her hands folded tight at her waist like she was holding herself together. Jack had told her it would be simple. Just a short ride. Just a talk where no one could twist things the wrong way. He said it was the only way to calm the town before the whispers turned ugly. But nothing about the scene felt simple. The wagon was already hitched, lantern hanging from the side like an eye that refused to blink. The horse shifted impatiently, as if it knew something was wrong. Everything felt prepared in a way that made her uneasy, like decisions had been made before she'd ever agreed to show up. Jack stepped closer, his boots slow on the dirt. "You look nervous," he said, almost kindly. "You don't need to be." Emily swallowed. "I thought we were just talking." "We are," he said. "That's all." But he stood too close. His voice stayed calm, but his body didn't leave space. He looked past her once, checking the darkness like a man, making sure no one was watching. "You trust me," he said, not as a question. Something inside her tightened. "I don't know that I—" His hand closed around her arm. Not hard, not violent, just firm enough that she felt the truth settle in her bones. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a decision he'd already made. Her breath caught. "Jack," she said quietly. "Let go." That was when Thomas's voice cut through the dark. "Let her go." The yard went still. Even the horse stopped moving. A door creaked somewhere nearby and then shut again, too quickly, like someone pretending they hadn't seen a thing. Jack turned slowly. Surprise flashed across his face before it hardened into something sharp and ugly. "You always were slow," he said, forcing a laugh. "Slow to see what's right in front of you." Thomas stepped forward, shoulders squared, his jaw tight, but his voice steady. "This ends now." Jack laughed louder than necessary. He shoved Emily aside, just enough to clear space between them. "You think you're the hero," he snapped. "You don't even know what she needs." That was when Thomas hit him. It wasn't wild. It wasn't reckless. It was clean and heavy, the kind of punch that came from a man who had spent his whole life holding things back. Jack went down hard, dust rising around him under the lantern light. He came up swinging, shouting, reaching for anything he could grab. The two of them crashed into each other, boots scraping, breath sharp, years of unspoken resentment finally spilling into the open. Emily backed away, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This wasn't about gossip anymore. This wasn't about misunderstanding. This was about who believed they owned her. Jack lunged again, fury burning in his eyes. Thomas blocked him, shoved him back, and spoke low enough that only his brother could hear. "You don't touch her," he said. "You don't speak for her. And you don't get to hide behind this town." Someone shouted for the sheriff. Another voice yelled for them to stop. But the truth had already started to surface, ugly and undeniable. As Jack stumbled toward the wagon, trying to regain control, a ranch hand stepped forward. Then another. They'd seen how ready everything was. The wagon, the timing, the grip on her arm. The whispers began to change direction. Thomas moved to Emily and stood between her and everything else. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence alone said what words couldn't. "You're not alone anymore." The crowd didn't rush in. That was the strange part. People hovered at the edges of the livery yard like they weren't sure which version of the story they were supposed to believe anymore. A few lanterns had been lifted from hooks, their light uneven, making shadows stretch and bend across the dirt. Faces that had once felt certain now looked careful. Jack wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and laughed like he hadn't just been knocked to the ground. "You see," he said, spreading his hands. "This is what I'm dealing with. My brother loses his temper, and suddenly I'm the bad one. His voice was loud, practiced. He wanted the crowd back. Wanted the story where he still fit cleanly inside it. Someone muttered something about calling the sheriff. Another voice said they already had. Emily stood frozen near the fence, her arm aching where Jack's fingers had been. She kept rubbing it without realizing, like she could erase the feeling if she tried hard enough. Thomas didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Jack. "You planned this," he said quietly. Not accusing. Certain. Jack scoffed. "Planned what? Talking? You don't get to decide what she agrees to." That was when Emily stepped forward. It wasn't a big movement, just one step, but it felt like the ground shifted when she did. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't shake. That surprised her most of all. "I didn't agree to anything," she said. "He grabbed me. He told me I needed a proper husband, and he meant himself." The words hung there, plain and unpolished. For a moment, no one spoke. Then a ranch hand near the wagon cleared his throat. "I saw him waiting," the man said, long before she showed up. Another nodded. He said it would be quick, quiet, easier if she didn't make trouble. Jack's smile faltered. Just a crack. He looked around like he was searching for someone to pull him back on his solid ground. But the faces staring at him were different now. No longer hungry for scandal. Just watching. The sheriff finally arrived, boots heavy, badge catching the lantern light. He took in the scene without asking questions right away. Jack's dusty coat, Thomas's clenched hands, Emily's pale face, and the way she stood a little too stiff. "What's going on?" the sheriff asked. Jack jumped in first. "You're seeing this wrong," he said quickly. "She agreed to come with me. We were just talking." Thomas came charging in, swinging like a madman. The sheriff didn't answer right away. He looked at Emily. "Did you agree?" he asked. "No," she said. "Simple. Final." The sheriff exhaled through his nose, slow and tired. He'd seen the shape before, even if the details changed. He turned back to Jack, his expression hardening. "Step aside," he said. Jack opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time that night, he looked small. Thomas moved half a step closer to Emily. He didn't touch her, but she felt it. The steadiness. The choice to stand without claiming. The crowd began to thin, not because they were bored, but because the story they wanted had ended. Truth had a way of doing that. It didn't entertain. It just stayed. As the sheriff led Jack away, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her legs felt weak. Thomas noticed. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, then shook her head. "I will be." And for the first time since stepping off that train, she believed it. Morning came softer than anyone expected. The sun rose over Dodge Creek like it always had, slow and steady, as if nothing had happened. But the town felt different beneath it, like something fragile had cracked and settled into a new shape. People gathered near the livery yard again, though they stood farther apart now. Voices stayed low. Eyes dropped more often than they lifted. The hunger for spectacle had drained away, replaced by something quieter. Discomfort, maybe, or recognition. Not everyone changed at once. A few men still muttered when they thought no one was listening. Old habits didn't disappear overnight. But then an older rancher spoke up, his voice rough with years and dust. He said he'd seen Jack hanging around that wagon long before nightfall. Said he heard Jack telling Emily it would be easier if she didn't fight the town. No one argued with him. The sheriff listened, nodding once, like he was closing a book he'd already finished reading. "That's enough," he said. Jack stood off to the side, dust clinging to his coat, his face set hard. There was no speech, no defense left to make. The crowd didn't need convincing anymore. Quiet witnesses had done what shouting never could. Thomas didn't celebrate. He didn't look relieved. He stood beside Emily, close enough that she felt his presence without feeling hidden by it. That mattered more than she could explain. Emily looked around at the town that had judged her so quickly. She didn't apologize. She didn't plead for understanding. She just stayed standing, her back straight, her face tired but steady. That was when they really saw her. By midday, the story had changed. Not into something kind, just something honest. A man had crossed a line. A woman had spoken. Silence had finally chosen the side it should have chosen from the start. When the crowd thinned, Thomas and Emily walked back toward the ranch together. They didn't hurry. There was no reason to. The land stretched wide and open, cicadas humming, wind moving through the tall grass like a slow breath. Emily broke the silence. "Will it always be like this?" she asked. Being watched, being weighed. Thomas thought for a long moment before answering. "Some days will be harder," he said. "Some will be easier. But no one gets to decide who you or accept you." She nodded, letting the words settle. They didn't fix everything, but they gave her something solid to stand on. Behind them, Dodge Creek went back to its routines. But not all routines return unchanged. Some leave a mark, and sometimes that mark is enough. The days that followed didn't feel dramatic. There were no speeches, no apologies shouted across the street. Dodge Creek didn't work that way. Change came slow here, settling in the small spaces where people couldn't ignore it. Emily noticed it in the way the general store clerk hesitated before looking away, in the way a woman at church sat beside her instead of choosing another bench. No one said sorry, but no one said the old things either. That mattered. Still, the weight didn't lift all at once. Some mornings, Emily woke with her jaw tight, her dreams tangled in voices and lantern light. She moved through her chores carefully, listening for footsteps that weren't there anymore. Healing, she learned, wasn't loud. It was repetitive. It asked for patience she didn't always have. Thomas never pushed her talk. He worked the ranch the same way he always had, steady and quiet. But now, when he passed her a cup of water or held a gate open, there was something new in the space between them. Not expectation, respect. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold, Emily finally spoke. "I was afraid," she said. "Not just of him, of everyone." Thomas leaned against the fence beside her. "I know." She waited, then asked the question she'd been carrying. "Why didn't you say more?" When they were talking, he considered it carefully. "Because I wanted you to speak when you were ready. And because I trusted you would." That stayed with her. The town still watched, but not the same way. It watched itself now, too. People measured their words, aware they'd been part of something they didn't like seeing in the daylight. Jack's absence was felt more than his presence ever had been. Not because he was missed, but because space had opened where his voice used to fill everything. Some men avoided talking about it. Others tried to laugh it off. But the laughter didn't land the same. Emily began writing again. Slowly at first. Thomas walked beside her until she asked him not to. The first time she wrote alone, her hands shook on her reins. She breathed through it, stayed upright, finished the loop. That night, she slept without dreaming. Weeks passed. Dodge Creek didn't become kind overnight, but it became quieter in the ways that mattered. The kind of quiet where a woman could stand without shrinking. One afternoon, Emily stood on the porch and watched the wind move through the grass. She realized something then. She hadn't come here just to survive a marriage. She'd come to learn who she was when no one was writing her story for her. And that, she understood, was worth staying for. By the time autumn touched Dodge Creek, the land had changed color, and so had the people living on it. The heat softened. The edges blurred. Things that once felt sharp lost their hold. Emily noticed it most in herself. She moved differently now. Not louder. Not harder. Just steadier. When she walked through town, her shoulders stayed level. When someone met her eyes, she didn't rush to look away. She had learned something the hard way, something no letter or promise could have taught her. Survival wasn't about endurance alone. It was about knowing when to stand still and let the truth catch up. Thomas never asked her to stay. That mattered most of all. One evening, as the light faded and the ranch settled into its quiet rhythms, Emily spoke first. "I didn't come here knowing who I was," she said. "I thought I was becoming someone else's life." Thomas nodded. Most people do. She looked out at the open land, the kind of land that didn't care what people whispered. "I'm not afraid of this place anymore," she said. "I'm afraid of places where silence is easier than doing what's right." Thomas didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. "Towns don't change because they want to," he said. "They change because someone refuses to disappear." Dodge Creek never apologized. It never would. But it learned in its own quiet way. It learned that gossip carried weight, that silence could be a weapon, that choosing comfort over truth always cost someone else more. Jack became a story people told less often as time passed. Not because he was forgiven, but because he was understood. And once a town understands the truth, it can't pretend ignorance again. Emily stayed, not because she was trapped, not because she owed anyone anything, but because she chose to, and that choice changed everything. Years later, people would still argue about what they saw that summer. But the ones who paid attention remembered something simpler. They remembered a woman who stood her ground, a man who stood beside her without claiming her voice, in a town that learned, too late but not too late, that judgment was easy and courage was not. The truth didn't shout that night under the lanterns. It didn't beg to be believed. It simply waited, and when it finally spoke, it reminded everyone of something that still matters. Doing the right thing rarely feels comfortable, but choosing not to do always leaves a deeper wound. And when it's your turn to decide, the only question that matters is this: will you stand with the crowd or with the truth?